It is summer in Illinois. In June, 22-year-old Karla Brown is discovered lifeless in the basement of her house. The murder seems like the perfect crime. Investigators are faced with a mystery and find hardly any clues. It is not until years later that forensic experts make an astonishing discovery in a previously ignored photo of the crime scene. 22-year-old Karla Brown recently bought a house in Wood River, Illinois, with her fiancé, Mark Hurd. Family and friends saw this as the beginning of a new chapter in their relationship after numerous difficulties in the past. Karla was an attractive young girl in her hometown, and later a charming young woman who was popular with everyone, girls and boys alike. She was a cheerleader in high school and had taken various courses at university. On June 21st, Karla took a day off to unpack her things. During a phone call with a friend, they agreed to meet for dinner. Suddenly, Karla interrupted the conversation and said, "Hang on, I'll call you right back. Someone's at the door." Those were the last words her friend heard from her. Around 5 p.m., Karla's fiancé returns from work with a friend. Karla is hanging upside down in a bucket of water. A man had obviously punched her in the face. She had a large wound on her forehead and one on her chin. She was tied up. Her head was hanging in a large bucket of water. When her boyfriend came home, he had to get her out of there. She was already in a state of rigor mortis. Her hands were tied behind her back. There was evidence of a fight for life and death, and we strongly suspected that she had been raped. Some details confused the investigators. There are 2 stockings around her neck, and they look remarkably neat for such a life-threatening situation. The power cord tying her hands is far too loose for her not to have been able to resist. The binding behind her back is so loose that her hands were almost completely free. It almost seems as if the cord was long enough to grab the attacker. She is wearing a sweater, which, according to her fiancé, she never wears in summer. The fact that the top button is buttoned up doesn't fit in with the fierce fight that has obviously taken place. The stockings around Karla's neck belong to her fiancé. The investigators find one of the stockings in the closet and the other under the sofa in the next room. There, they also discover a pool of water stained with blood. The sofa cushions are wet, and there are drops of blood on the floor above. A coffee pot is stuck between the ceiling brackets. To the homicide investigators, it looks as if the perpetrator tried to rinse the blood out of the sofa cushions with the pot. It appears that the actual attack took place next to and on the sofa. The body was later taken into the next room and placed next to the bucket of water. Based on the staged crime scene evidence, investigators conclude that the perpetrator lingered in the house for some time after the murder. There are no signs of forced entry, but they do find blood on the back door, which is probably the killer's escape route. But who knew that Karla Brown was home alone that day? And who had the time to change the crime scene afterwards and clean the sofa? At the beginning of their investigation, the police take a close look at Karla Brown's fiancé. He is a suspect from the outset, as a common saying among police officers goes, "Before you look for criminals, look for relatives." But Mark Hurd has an alibi. On the day of the murder, he was at work and spending his lunch break with friends. 2 neighbors who witnessed Karla and her fiancé moving in are also questioned. One of them recognizes Karla as a former classmate, but she is not particularly pleased. Both neighbors have an alibi for the day of the crime and voluntarily pass a lie detector test. Although the crime scene was tampered with, the murderer left very few clues. The night before the murder, Karla and Mark had a housewarming party, so the house is full of hair and fingerprints. However, the investigation does not lead to any further clues. The perpetrator was apparently very lucky. You can't plan a perfect murder. You have to commit it to get away with it. Luck and the avoidance of evidence are crucial, which is exactly what this perpetrator seems to have achieved. With no additional clues, the police turn to the FBI and ask behavioral scientist John Douglas to create a psychological profile of the killer. A psychological profile is created on the basis of scientific findings and intuition. The information needed for this comes from criminals who have committed similar crimes. Douglas looks at the crime scene photos and makes some new discoveries. We distinguish between organized and disorganized crime. By disorganized, we mean extreme negligence and carelessness on the part of the perpetrator, which often results in impulsive acts. Organized, on the other hand, describes a high degree of sophistication and planning. A similar pattern was also identified by criminalist Stephen Harbour. He looks at the crime scene from a psychological perspective and draws conclusions about both the crime and the perpetrator. Could it be a chaotic crime scene? One could assume that the perpetrator may have struck for the first time due to a lack of routine. Since the perpetrator spent a lot of time in the house, it is assumed that he knew his victim and his everyday life and possibly lived nearby. Behavioral scientist John Douglas goes even further. The killer was a white, unmarried man in his mid to late 20s. He had graduated from high school and his appearance was very untidy. According to Douglas, the fact that the killer used a cable to tie up his victim indicates that he either had shop class or vocational training in a trade. Douglas also tells investigators that they may have even interviewed the killer. He might be able to pass a polygraph test, he says. And then it got kind of spooky. I was sitting there and I just couldn't believe what he was saying. He started talking about how this person would react to different situations. So he was most likely driving a Volkswagen that was either red or orange. There were indications that the murderer had initially left the house uncleaned. There was still blood on the back door, on the fence post and behind the yard. That's how John knew that the murderer hadn't cleaned anything at first, but had gone out covered in blood. Only someone who intended to clean everything later would do that. That's why investigators are focusing once again on the two men next door who watched Karla Brown and her fiancé move in. But the investigators need more than just a psychological profile. 2 years later, there are still no concrete clues in the murder case of 22-year-old Karla Brown. The crime scene pointed to a sex crime, but the autopsy ruled this out. Some perpetrators staged the crime scene to simulate a different scenario or motive. For example, a classic robbery murder can be presented as a sex crime or a relationship crime, as a stranger's crime. The case of Karla Brown has left criminologists such as Alpha Bush in awe. He continues to have questions, especially about the wounds on Karla's face and chin. A decisive turning point occurs when Alpha Bush attends a seminar on image magnification led by Dr. Homer Campbell, a medical examiner from New Mexico. Dr. Campbell explains a technique that allows photographs and computer images to be enlarged and enhanced to reveal details that would otherwise remain hidden. This method has been used for years to test materials for harmlessness, and archaeologists use it to discover ancient ruins in aerial photographs. After the seminar, Bush tells Dr. Campbell about the Karla Brown murder case. "Doctor, I have a case for you," he says, explaining that they have been unable to find out how the injuries to Karla's face were caused. He asks him to send him the pictures of the deceased and the autopsy report. On the image enlarger, Dr. Campbell takes a close look at the images of the crime scene. This system not only improves the contrast of images, but can also create a three-dimensional view by adding depth to the image. When Dr. Campbell is finished, he knows what caused the injuries to Karla Brown's face. He said that she may have been hit with the TV table. This table was lying on the floor and was only 1 meter away from the sofa where we found the traces of blood. I hadn't noticed that. The table still lies untouched in the police evidence room 2 years after the murder. With a lot of luck, Dr. Campbell finds traces of blood and hair on the tray under the microscope. But then he finds something that everyone else has overlooked so far. And now the investigators know that they are not dealing with a perfect murder. The murderer has left his signature. The investigation into the murder of Karla Brown takes a surprising turn. With the help of an image enhancement device, Dr. Homer Campbell discovers a crucial clue. When they enlarge the image, They recognize a bite mark on the shoulder where even the individual teeth are clearly visible. This evidence would be more valuable to the investigators than several eyewitness accounts, as such marks are precise and rule out sources of error. The murderer has thus left an unmistakable clue. Now all the police need is a suspect. 2 years after the murder, the police again turned to Karla Brown's 2 neighbors who matched the FBI's behavioral profile. The police checked their alibis again. Although both passed the lie detector test, a clue comes to light. John told a friend that he had seen Karla's body. He described the position of the body and mentioned bite marks on her neck and collarbone. But when Karla's body was found, only police officers were in the house. This information made the police sit up and take notice. Because at the time, absolutely nobody knew that there were bite marks on Karla Brown's body. Neither the police, nor the pathologists, nor the prosecutors. Only the murderer knew these details. That was a shock, because only the killer himself could have such information. Even the position of the body could only be known by someone who had either been present during the search or had placed the body there themselves. The police had not passed on any information about this to the public or the media. Since the bite marks were overlooked during the first autopsy, investigators want to make sure that everything is thoroughly examined this time. Karla Brown's body is exhumed after 2 years, and the second autopsy is performed by Dr. Mary Case, St. Louis's chief medical examiner. The first autopsy only found that she had been strangled, while the head was not examined in detail. Dr. Case opened the cranial cavity and discovered bruising on the scalp. The question arose as to whether this injury might have caused unconsciousness. Dr. Case suspected that Karla Brown may have been alive when her head was pushed into the barrel, as foam was found around her mouth when she was found. It is likely that she drowned, although she was initially strangled. During the autopsy, new images of the suspicious bite wounds will also be taken and sent to the New York Police Department's Forensic Institute. There, the impressions are independently assessed to ensure that the injury to Karla Brown's neck is indeed a bite wound. In my assessment, the pattern of the injury had all the characteristics of a bite wound. The investigators then send 3 casting impressions from different dentures to Dr. Levine to compare with the bite mark, without knowing who made the impressions. First, he makes wax impressions of the models and then compares them. The first 2 impressions don't match the bite wound, so I take the third model and check what specific marks these teeth could have left behind. I compare these with the images of Karla Brown's neck. In the end, I come to the conclusion that only a specific set of teeth could produce such bite marks. Dr. Levine measures the teeth, looks at the photos again, turns them in all directions, and finally places the dental impressions on the table. He points to one and explains, "This is your murderer." The print was made by John Prentice, who amazingly matches the psychological profile created by behavioral scientist John Douglas. He is in his late 20s and has had many complicated relationships with women in his past. He attends art school and has a well-groomed appearance. Prentice spends a lot of time in the area as he often visits his friend who lives in the house next door to Karla Brown. And just as Douglas suspects, Prentice has passed a lie detector test before. John Prentice drives a red Volkswagen, an exceptionally sharp perpetrator profile. There is no doubt that John Prentice murdered Karla Brown. It is only unclear whether he went into the house once or twice and what his friend next door knew. But there is no doubt that he killed her. The prosecution assumes that John Prentice went over to Karla Brown's house after making sure her fiancé had left for work. Karla is on the phone when it rings. John Prentice is standing in the doorway, but Karla won't let him in. She rejects his advances and a fight breaks out. He forces her into the cellar and hits her with the tray. Then he bites her shoulder and strangles her. Prentice stages the crime scene so that it looks like sexual abuse. But when he changes her clothes, he makes a mistake. He buttons the top button of her sweater, the first clue that the scene is staged. In the hustle and bustle of an event, important details can be overlooked, leading to gaps and unexplained events that make even experienced analysts wonder. This leads to the conclusion that someone may have tried to mislead the investigators. These are things that are then, of course, not properly thought through in the hectic pace of events, and then gaps arise or things happen that then have to be explained, which make every experienced analyst suspicious. Then he ties her hands together with a cable and wraps the stockings around her neck. Finally, he pushes her head under the water while she is probably only unconscious and still alive. Prentice tries to remove the bloodstains on the sofa. He then hides the can under the wooden beam of the ceiling. The clothes Karla was wearing that day are never found. Presumably Prentice took them with him as a kind of trophy. John Prentice is sentenced to 90 years in prison for murder. The Karla Brown case is finally closed after 5 long years. He was caught because the investigation techniques beat him. At first he was lucky and got away with it, but the investigative techniques were his misfortune. Karla's family was so impressed with the bite mark evidence that they gave Dr. Levine a poster as a token of their appreciation. On it was a quote from Don himself. "You can lie through your teeth, but your teeth don't lie." And around the edge is a pattern of rectangles and triangles, the pattern from the bite. Where normal investigative methods failed, science helps.